The mind is where every battle is decided long before it ever shows up in your behavior, your relationships, or your circumstances. What happens outwardly is usually the echo of something that has already taken place inwardly. Before a choice is made, a thought was entertained. Before a habit was formed, a belief was accepted. Before a direction was taken, a mindset was established. That is why the real fight is not over what you do, but over how you think. If the enemy can influence your thinking, he doesn't need to control your actions, because your actions will eventually follow your thoughts. Spiritual warfare is not always loud, dramatic, or obvious. Most of the time it is quiet, subtle, and repetitive. It shows up as doubt that sounds reasonable, fear that feels protective, and negativity that disguises itself as realism. These thoughts don't announce themselves as attacks. They present themselves as logic. They replay past failures, exaggerate present challenges, and distort future possibilities. When left unchecked, they begin to shape identity. You stop saying, "I feel afraid," and start believing, "This is just who I am." That shift marks a loss of ground in the battlefield of the mind. Many people are praying for victory in their lives while allowing defeat to live rent-free in their thinking. They worship God with their lips, but rehearse fear in their minds. They declare faith publicly, but privately meditate on worst-case scenarios. This inner conflict weakens spiritual authority because alignment is divided. A divided mind struggles to stand firm. That is why Scripture repeatedly calls for guarding the mind, renewing the mind, and setting the mind. Victory is not accidental, it is intentional, and it begins with what you allow to occupy your thoughts. The enemy understands that he does not need to destroy you if he can distract you, discourage you, or deceive you. A discouraged mind loses motivation. A distracted mind loses focus. A deceived mind loses direction. These are not emotional issues alone. They are strategic attacks. When your mind is overwhelmed, your faith feels distant even when God is near. When your thoughts are chaotic, peace feels unavailable even when nothing has changed externally. This reveals that the battlefield is internal before it is external. God's approach to transformation always starts with the mind, because behavior modification without mental renewal is temporary. You can change actions for a season. If the thinking remains the same, old patterns eventually return. That is why God does not just command you to act differently, He calls you to think differently. Renewed thinking produces sustained change because it reshapes how you interpret life, respond to pressure, and perceive yourself. The mind determines how you interpret truth. Two people can hear the same word, face the same challenge, and experience completely different outcomes based on mindset. One sees an obstacle and retreats. Another sees an opportunity and advances. The difference is not information, it is interpretation. Interpretation flows from mindset. When the mind is aligned with truth, faith becomes active. When the mind is saturated with fear, faith becomes dormant. This battlefield is fought daily, not occasionally. Thoughts do not need permission to appear, but they do require permission to stay. What you repeatedly entertain eventually becomes what you believe. Belief then becomes expectation, and expectation shapes behavior. This progression explains why unmanaged thinking slowly rewrites destiny. The mind sets the direction long before the feet ever move. God fixing the mind is not about removing all negative thoughts. It is about replacing lies with truth. Truth creates stability. Truth creates clarity. Truth creates confidence. When truth governs the mind, circumstances lose the power to dictate identity or worth. Pressure no longer defines purpose. Failure no longer determines future. The battlefield shifts when truth takes authority. Victory in the mind does not mean absence of struggle. It means presence of discipline. Discipline to challenge thoughts. Discipline to reject lies. Discipline to rehearse truth consistently. This discipline strengthens spiritual resilience. Over time, the mind becomes less reactive and more grounded. Peace becomes less dependent on outcomes and more rooted in alignment. When the mind is aligned with God, reactions change. Fear loses volume. Hope gains strength. Perspective widens. You stop interpreting life through trauma, disappointment, or insecurity and start interpreting it through purpose and promise. This shift does not happen instantly, but it happens intentionally as the mind is surrendered, trained, and renewed. The mind is the battlefield because it is where control is contested. Whoever wins the mind influences the direction of the life. God does not just want your behavior, He wants your thinking, because transformed thinking produces transformed living, sustained faith, consistent peace, and spiritual authority that remains steady even when circumstances fluctuate and pressure increases. Without warning or explanation, wrong thinking does not create imaginary problems. It creates real ones. When thinking is distorted, life responds accordingly. Many struggles that feel external are actually the result of internal conclusions that were never challenged. Thoughts shape interpretation. Interpretation shapes decisions, and decisions shape outcomes. When thinking is wrong, the problems that follow are logical, predictable, and often painful. Life is not malfunctioning, it is responding accurately to the mindset that governs it. Wrong thinking often sounds reasonable. It presents itself as caution or self-protection. It says things like, this is just how things are, nothing ever works out for me, or I've tried before and failed. These thoughts feel safe because they limit expectation, but they quietly imprison possibility. When expectation is lowered, effort weakens. When effort weakens, opportunities are missed. The problem is not the opportunity, it is the thinking that prevented engagement. What feels like bad luck is often the result of belief shaping behavior. Many people ask God to fix problems that are the fruit of unchecked thinking. They want peace but rehearse anxiety. They want growth but feed doubt. They want change but protect familiar mindsets. Wrong thinking creates environments where fear thrives, faith struggles, and clarity fades. It does not mean the person lacks intelligence or spirituality. It means their thinking has been shaped by experience more than truth. Experience can teach lessons, but it cannot be allowed to write conclusions that contradict purpose. Wrong thinking also distorts self-perception. When the mind believes lies about worth, ability, or identity, behavior follows those beliefs. Someone who believes they are inadequate will avoid responsibility. Someone who believes they are unworthy will tolerate unhealthy relationships. Someone who believes failure defines them will stop trying. These are not personality traits, they are mental agreements. Problems then arise that appear relational, financial, or emotional, but the root remains cognitive. The mind acts like a filter. Whatever passes through it is interpreted before it is acted upon. If the filter is damaged, even good opportunities look dangerous, and even helpful correction feels like rejection. Wrong thinking turns neutral situations into threats and challenges into confirmations of fear. Over time, this creates patterns of avoidance, defensiveness, and stagnation. Life shrinks not because God withheld blessing, but because the mind misinterpreted the path. Wrong thinking also affects spiritual life. When thoughts are misaligned, faith becomes fragile. Prayer feels ineffective. Scripture feels distant. Worship becomes routine rather than connection. The issue is not God's presence, it is perception. Thinking shapes how truth is received. When the mind is convinced that change is impossible, truth is heard but not believed. Belief determines response, and response determines growth. Problems created by wrong thinking are often right because they logically follow the belief system in place. If you believe you are always overlooked, you stop advocating for yourself. If you believe effort does not matter, discipline fades. If you believe people cannot be trusted, isolation grows. These outcomes are not random. They are consistent with the thoughts that produced them. Life aligns with belief even when belief is wrong. God's solution is not to remove problems without addressing thinking, because unresolved thinking will recreate the same problems in new forms. That is why transformation begins with renewing the mind. Renewal replaces assumptions with truth, reactions with discernment, and fear with perspective. When thinking changes, problems either diminish or become manageable. Some challenges disappear entirely because they were sustained by belief rather than reality. Wrong thinking thrives when it goes unchallenged. Silence allows lies to sound true. Repetition gives them authority. Challenging thoughts requires awareness and discipline. It means questioning conclusions, testing assumptions, and aligning interpretation with truth rather than emotion. This process is uncomfortable because it disrupts familiarity, but it is necessary for growth. When thinking becomes aligned, problems lose their grip. Challenges are still present, but they no longer define identity or direction. Decisions become clearer. Confidence strengthens. Peace increases not because life is perfect, but because perception is accurate. Correct thinking does not guarantee ease, but it guarantees clarity. God fixing the mind is not about positive thinking, it is about truthful thinking. Truth exposes lies and dismantles the mental structures that supported them. As thinking is corrected, behavior adjusts naturally. Problems that once felt overwhelming begin to shrink, not because circumstances changed, but because interpretation did. Right thinking produces right responses, and right responses create healthier outcomes that reflect alignment rather than confusion, purpose rather than fear, and stability rather than repeated struggle, rooted in beliefs that no longer have authority over the mind or direction of life. God does not begin transformation by changing circumstances. He begins by changing the way the mind processes life. External change without internal renewal is temporary, but when thought patterns are renewed, transformation becomes sustainable. The mind interprets reality, assigns meaning to experience, and determines response. If those internal systems remain unchanged, even blessings can become burdens and opportunities can be mishandled. God targets thought patterns because they quietly govern behavior long before action becomes visible. Thought patterns are formed through repetition. Experiences, conversations, disappointments, and expectations leave impressions that settle into beliefs. Over time, these beliefs operate automatically, shaping reactions without conscious effort. This is why people can desire change, yet repeatedly return to familiar patterns. The mind has learned a rhythm, and it defaults to what feels known, even when it is unhealthy. God's work of renewal interrupts this cycle, introducing truth where assumption once ruled and perspective where fear once dominated. Transformation requires replacing lies, not just managing behavior. You can discipline actions temporarily, but unmanaged thinking will eventually pull behavior back to its original state. God renews thought patterns by confronting internal agreements that contradict truth. These agreements may sound like self-protection, realism, or humility, but if they oppose God's promises, they must be dismantled. Renewal is not denial of reality. It is reinterpretation of reality through truth rather than fear or past experience. Renewed thinking changes how challenges are perceived. Instead of seeing obstacles as evidence of failure, they are recognized as opportunities for growth. Instead of interpreting delay as rejection, it is seen as preparation. This shift alters emotional response and behavioral choices. When thinking changes, pressure does not disappear, but resilience increases. Faith becomes active not because circumstances improve, but because interpretation aligns with purpose. God renews the mind through consistent exposure to truth. Truth must be rehearsed to override ingrained patterns. A single moment of insight is not enough to undo years of conditioned thinking. Renewal is progressive, requiring intention and repetition. As truth is repeatedly applied, old patterns weaken and new ones form. Over time, reactions become measured, decisions become clearer, and emotional stability increases. This is evidence of transformation taking place internally before it manifests externally. Renewed thought patterns also reshape identity. When the mind no longer agrees with lies about worth, capacity, or purpose, behavior naturally adjusts. Confidence grows, not from ego, but from alignment. Fear loses authority because it no longer defines expectation. The mind begins to reflect God's perspective rather than past pain or limitation. This internal shift produces outward consistency. Actions become aligned with purpose rather than driven by insecurity or comparison. Spiritual growth accelerates when the mind is renewed. Prayer becomes focused. Scripture becomes relevant. Worship becomes personal. The disconnect between belief and experience narrows because thinking supports faith rather than contradicting it. God's voice becomes clearer because internal noise has decreased. Discernment sharpens as truth replaces assumption. This clarity strengthens trust and responsiveness, deepening relationship rather than simply improving behavior. Renewal also changes habits. Habits are sustained by belief. When belief shifts, habit loses support. Behaviors that once felt impossible to change become manageable because the underlying thinking no longer reinforces them. Transformation becomes less about willpower and more about alignment. God's renewal works from the inside out, ensuring that change is not forced but natural. God changes lives by renewing thought patterns because thinking governs interpretation, interpretation governs response, and response governs outcome. When thought patterns align with truth, life begins to reflect that alignment. Peace increases, direction clarifies, purpose becomes evident. Transformation is no longer something pursued through effort alone. It becomes the natural result of a mind trained to process life through truth rather than fear, faith rather than doubt, and purpose rather than past experience, allowing internal alignment to consistently produce external change across decisions. relationships, and direction without relying on temporary motivation or circumstantial improvement. Peace is not produced by perfect conditions. It is produced by a properly aligned mind. Many people chase peace by trying to control circumstances, believing that if situations improve, emotions will settle. But peace that depends on external stability is fragile. It rises and falls with circumstances, moods, and outcomes. God's design for peace is different. He offers a peace that remains steady even when life is unpredictable. That peace begins internally, rooted in how the mind is aligned, not in what is happening around you. Circumstances are constantly changing. Relationships fluctuate, finances shift, health varies, and plans are interrupted. If peace is tied to these variables, it will always be unstable. The mind becomes reactive, scanning the environment for threats, changes, or disappointments. This constant vigilance exhausts the soul. God does not intend for peace to be something you chase externally. He intends it to be something you cultivate internally. Mental alignment with truth creates peace that is resilient, not reactive. Mental alignment means agreeing with God's perspective rather than interpreting life through fear, anxiety, or past pain. When the mind is aligned, it filters circumstances through trust instead of panic. Challenges are acknowledged without being magnified. Problems are addressed without being personalized. This alignment does not deny difficulty. It prevents difficulty from dominating emotional space. Peace flows naturally when the mind is anchored in what is stable rather than what is temporary. Many people lose peace not because circumstances are severe, but because interpretation is distorted. The mind tells stories that intensify fear, predict failure, and replay past disappointment. These mental narratives create emotional turmoil even in relatively stable situations. When the mind is misaligned, peace feels unreachable regardless of external improvement. Even good circumstances are overshadowed by worry because the internal environment remains unsettled. God's peace operates independently of circumstance because it is rooted in trust. Trust stabilizes thought. When the mind trusts God's character sovereignty, and time in it does not panic when outcomes are uncertain. Uncertainty no longer feels threatening. It becomes a space where faith operates. This trust-based thinking produces calm responses instead of anxious reactions. Peace becomes the default state because alignment has replaced fear as the governing influence. Mental alignment also reduces emotional volatility. When the mind is disciplined to focus on truth, emotions follow that leadership. Feelings no longer dictate perspective. Perspective informs feelings. This order matters. When emotions lead, peace is unstable. When truth leads, peace is sustained. God designed the mind to guide the heart, not the other way around. Alignment restores that order. Peace flowing from mental alignment also strengthens decision-making. An anxious mind rushes, avoids, or overreacts. A peaceful mind evaluates, discerns, and responds intentionally. Decisions made from peace are rarely regretted because they are not driven by pressure. Alignment slows reaction and increases wisdom, even in urgent situations. A settled mind produces clearer judgment. External peace can be interrupted, but internal peace can be protected. Noise, conflict, and uncertainty may surround you, but they do not have to dominate you. Mental alignment creates boundaries. It determines what is allowed to stay and what must be dismissed. Not every thought deserves attention. Not every fear deserves agreement. Peace flows when the mind learns to reject intrusion and remain anchored. God does not promise a life free of trouble, but He promises peace that transcends it. This peace is not emotional numbness. It is spiritual stability. It allows you to feel without being controlled by feelings. It allows you to face reality without being overwhelmed by it. Mental alignment makes this possible by grounding perception in truth rather than circumstance. When the mind is aligned, peace becomes less fragile. Delays no longer create panic. Opposition no longer destroys confidence. Uncertainty no longer robs joy. Peace remains because it is sourced internally, not externally. This peace strengthens endurance. It allows you to persist without burnout, to wait without frustration, and to move forward without fear. God fixing the mind restores peace because peace was never meant to be circumstantial. It was designed to flow from alignment with truth, trust, and perspective. When thinking is disciplined, anchored, and surrendered, peace becomes consistent. It no longer depends on what happens next, who responds, or how quickly answers arrive. It remains present, steady, and accessible even when life is unpredictable, complex, and demanding. allowing stability to replace anxiety and confidence to replace fear as the mind stays anchored in alignment rather than reacting to ever-changing external conditions. What controls your thoughts ultimately controls the direction of your life, because thoughts are the starting point of every movement you make. Before you ever step forward, you think forward. Before you retreat, you think retreat. Direction is not chosen in a moment. It is established through repeated thinking over time. Your thoughts quietly shape your expectations, your confidence, your decisions, and your willingness to move. If thinking is misaligned, direction will eventually drift, even if intentions are good. Thoughts function like an internal compass. They determine what feels possible, safe, or worthwhile. When fear dominates thinking, direction bends toward avoidance. When doubt dominates, direction bends toward hesitation. When insecurity dominates, direction bends toward comparison. You may believe you are choosing freely, but in reality, your thoughts are guiding your steps. This is why two people with similar opportunities can end up in completely different places. The difference is not opportunity, it is thought control. Many people believe their direction is determined by circumstances, but circumstances only influence what the mind already believes. If the mind believes failure is inevitable, it will interpret obstacles as confirmation. If the mind believes growth is possible, it will interpret the same obstacles as temporary. Direction follows interpretation, and interpretation flows from thought patterns. This is why changing surroundings without changing thinking rarely produces lasting change. The mind carries its conclusions wherever it goes. Thoughts also determine consistency. Direction is not just about where you start, it is about where you continue. Motivation may begin a journey, but thinking sustains it. When thoughts are disciplined, progress continues even when emotions fluctuate. When thoughts are unmanaged, direction becomes unstable, driven by feelings rather than purpose. You start and stop, advance and retreat, commit and withdraw, not because direction is unclear, but because thought control is weak. Control does not mean suppression, it means governance. Thoughts will come, but they do not all deserve authority. The mind must be trained to evaluate rather than absorb. When every thought is accepted as truth, direction becomes chaotic. Contradictory impulses pull you in multiple directions. Clarity fades, purpose feels distant. Thought control restores order by deciding which ideas lead and which are dismissed. What you consistently think about becomes what you consistently move toward. Attention fuels direction. When attention is fixed on fear, energy flows toward protection and avoidance. When attention is fixed on purpose, energy flows toward growth and progress. This is why distraction is so dangerous. It fragments attention and weakens direction. A distracted mind may be busy, but it is rarely moving forward intentionally. Thought control also affects resilience. Direction is tested under pressure. When challenges arise, uncontrolled thoughts amplify difficulty, making obstacles feel overwhelming. Controlled thoughts maintain perspective, allowing direction to remain steady even when progress slows. The difference is not strength, it is mindset. A mind anchored in truth does not abandon direction when resistance appears. It adjusts pace without changing course. Identity is also shaped by thought control, and identity influences direction. If you think of yourself as incapable, direction narrows. If you think of yourself as called, direction expands. Identity-driven thinking either limits or releases movement. Direction follows the boundaries set by self-perception, and self-perception is reinforced by repeated thoughts. Changing direction, therefore, requires changing internal dialogue. Thoughts determine decision-making speed and quality. An anxious mind rushes or avoids. A disciplined mind evaluates and commits. Direction suffers when decisions are reactive rather than intentional. Controlled thinking creates space between stimulus and response, allowing wisdom to guide movement rather than impulse. This steadiness keeps direction aligned even in uncertain environments. God focuses on the mind because direction flows from it naturally. He does not need to force movement. He reshapes thinking so movement follows willingly. When thoughts align with truth, direction aligns with purpose. Life begins to move with intention rather than reaction. Detours decrease. Consistency increases. Progress becomes measurable. Control of thought does not remove struggle, but it prevents struggle from redefining direction. Setbacks no longer rewrite purpose. Delays no longer cancel calling. Controlled thinking keeps direction intact, even when pace changes. You may slow down, but you do not turn back. You may pause, But you do not abandon. What controls your thoughts controls your direction, because thinking determines focus, focus determines decisions, and decisions determine movement. When the mind is surrendered, trained, and aligned, direction becomes clear and stable. Life stops drifting and starts moving intentionally toward purpose, not because circumstances improve, but because internal governance has been restored and thought leadership has been established, where confusion once ruled and reaction once dictated movement without awareness or alignment.